just after 4 in the morning, the 6th of June 1944, a German officer inside one of the 4 concrete gun casemates at Merville, a battery position that had been bombed by the Royal Air Force more than once in the weeks before this night, and had survived every single time. Walls of 6 feet of solid reinforced concrete, still standing after direct hits that should, by any reasonable calculation, have caved them in, was about to watch that same position fall to an attacking force he had no way of anticipating, because nothing about how it arrived matched anything his defenses were built to detect. Merville was never a lightly held outpost. It sat behind a cattle fence, then a minefield 100 yards deep, then a second belt of concertina wire 15 feet thick and 5 feet high, then an anti-tank ditch 400 yards long, 15 feet wide, 10 feet deep, wrapped around a garrison of roughly 130 men manning machine guns, anti-aircraft cannon, and 4 guns believed capable of raking the beach the British were about to land on, 6 miles away. This was not a position anyone expected to fall to a raid. It was built layer by layer on the same premise every fortified point on the Atlantic Wall had been built on, that anything strong enough to actually get through this much obstacle would have to bring enough force, enough engineering, enough sustained firepower that the garrison would see it coming with time to spare. And on paper, the plan assembled to take this position agreed with that premise completely. It called for 100 heavy bombers dropping 4,000-pound bombs directly onto the battery half an hour before the ground assault. It called for 3 gliders packed with 50 men and enough explosive to blow the wire open in seconds, landing inside the perimeter in a single coordinated strike. It called for a battalion of 750 paratroopers, jeeps, mortars, mine detectors, and Bangalore torpedoes moving in with everything an army of the period considered necessary to crack a position exactly this hard. Almost none of that arrived. What actually crossed the wire in the minefield surrounding Merville that night was a scratch force, roughly a fifth the size of the plan, without a single mine detector, without a working mortar, and without most of its Bangalore torpedoes moving through 100 yards of German minefield on their hands and knees, marking the safe path not with tape or explosive, but by scuffing their own heel marks into the dirt in the dark. This is the story of how the least equipped version of a plan succeeded where the fully equipped version had already failed twice in the same night. Why? The German garrison, holding one of the strongest single positions on this stretch of coast, could not have seen it coming, because everything about how the attack was supposed to look had, by the time it actually reached them, already gone wrong. Part 1 to understand why Merville was considered a genuinely difficult objective, rather than simply a fortified nuisance. You have to understand what the battery represented in the wider invasion plan, and what the Germans had already spent months building into it. Intelligence believed the battery held 4 guns of 150 mm caliber. Weapons with a range easily sufficient to reach Sword Beach, the sector of the invasion coast assigned to the British 3rd Infantry Division, and to do serious damage to the ships and landing craft that would be crowding those waters in the opening hours of the invasion. Whether the guns actually matched that caliber would not be settled until British paratroopers stood inside the casemates themselves. The point, for planning purposes, was that Allied commanders could not risk finding out the hard way once the invasion fleet was already committed to the crossing. The position itself had been under construction and reinforcement for months. 4 heavily built concrete casemates arranged to cover the approaches, 2 of them roofed with as much as 12 feet of earth on top of the concrete itself. Weapons pits scattered through the perimeter, each holding multiple machine guns, an anti-aircraft cannon positioned to make any low approach by aircraft costly. This was not guesswork about German intentions. Bomber Command had already struck the battery more than once in the weeks leading up to the invasion, and on at least one of those raids had scored direct hits on a casemate roof, hits that failed to penetrate the reinforced concrete beneath. That detail matters enormously to what follows because it meant both sides, by the start of June, already had hard evidence about what it took to actually damage this position. The Germans knew their concrete had already survived real bombs delivered with real accuracy. The British knew the same thing, which is why the plan built to take Merville leaned so heavily, in every version drawn up beforehand, on overwhelming, coordinated, unmistakable force delivered from multiple directions at once. Because anything less had already been tried against these walls and had already failed to crack them. Lieutenant Colonel Terence Otway, commanding the 9th Parachute Battalion, was given the job of destroying the battery before the Seaburn landings began at dawn, and he built a plan around the assumption that this scale of obstacle demanded a correspondingly serious, correspondingly loud solution. An advance party of scouts would go in ahead of the main drop to reconnoiter the perimeter, cut the outer wire, and mark safe lanes through the minefield with white tape and mine detectors, clearing the way for the battalion that would follow. At midnight, roughly 100 RAF Lancasters and Halifaxes would strike the battery with 4,000-pound bombs, aiming to finish what earlier raids had started, or at minimum to shred the obstacle belts themselves ahead of the ground assault. 20 minutes later, the bulk of the battalion, 750 men carrying jeeps, mortars, machine guns, flamethrowers, and demolition stores, would parachute onto a drop zone nearby and move to the battery in force. And in the final stage, just before the ground assault went in, 3 Horsa gliders loaded with 50 additional men and explosive charges would land directly inside the battery perimeter itself. A coup de main strike meant to blow the inner wire open from the inside. In the same moment, the main assault hit it from without. Every part of that plan, the bombers, the gliders, the mine-clearing scouts, the mass of the battalion arriving with its full complement of heavy equipment, was designed to answer the obstacle with force, at least equal to what had built it. This was the version of the attack the German garrison, watching bombers return to this exact target for what would have been another in a string of raids, had every reasonable expectation of surviving the way it had survived every previous one. Because nothing in their experience of this site suggested that survival would depend on anything other than how thick the concrete was, and how many men were left standing in the weapons pits afterward. Part 2, almost none of it happened the way it was planned. And the reasons why are worth walking through carefully, because they explain both why the German garrison had no functioning warning that night and why the force that eventually did break through was so radically different from the one described on paper. The advance party of scouts did reach the perimeter ahead of the main drop, led in part by a small group under Captain Greenway, and they did their job, but not with the tools the plan had assumed they would have. Their mine detectors and marking tape had gone missing in the drop, along with much of the rest of the battalion's equipment. So instead, they crawled forward on their hands and knees in the dark, feeling ahead of themselves for tripwires, cutting the outer cattle fence by hand, and marking a narrow, safe path through the 100 yards of minefield not with tape, but by scuffing heel marks into the dirt with their boots, a method so primitive it left almost nothing for a defender to notice, even if he had been looking directly at the ground it crossed. They completed this work remarkably without a single casualty, moving slowly enough and quietly enough that a minefield built to punish exactly this kind of infiltration never registered that anyone had crossed it at all. The bombing raid, meanwhile, the loud, mechanized, unmistakable half of the plan, went in at midnight, roughly as scheduled, and missed the target almost entirely. Poor visibility and the standard difficulties of night bombing against a small, precisely defined objective sent most of the bomb load wide of the battery itself, cratering the surrounding fields and orchards rather than the wire, the minefield, or the casemates. The raid was meant to soften the garrison inside those casemates. Having already survived direct hits from earlier raids, they endured this one with even less damage than the ones before it. If anything, the raid confirmed for them exactly what their prior experience had already taught. That bombing alone, delivered from altitude at night, was not going to be the thing that took this position. The paratroop drop that followed at midnight scattered across a wide stretch of the Normandy countryside, the result of low cloud and flak over the drop zone, and the ordinary difficulty of delivering 750 men accurately from aircraft under fire in the dark. Of the 700 each men who jumped, only around 150 reached the battalion's rendezvous point in time to take part in the assault, and almost none of the heavy equipment made it with them. The mortars were gone, the jeeps were gone. Most of the Bangalore torpedoes, the explosive charges specifically carried to blow wide lanes through exactly this kind of wire belt, were gone, scattered with the containers that had carried them. Across miles of countryside, the men themselves would never reach in time. The final element, the coup de main gliders, meant to land 50 additional men and demolition charges directly inside the perimeter at 4 fared no better. Of the 3, 1 was shot down by German anti-aircraft fire well short of the target. A second, its towing cable damaged, was forced into an early release and never left England at all. The third came in on its final approach toward the battery, was spotted and fired on by a machine gun that wounded several men aboard, and threw the glider off its line, and its pilot, seeing at the last moment a sign warning that he was about to put the aircraft down in the middle of the minefield itself, pulled up and crash-landed instead in woodland some 750 yards from the objective. Wrecked, the survivors climbed out in time, only to ambush a German patrol moving toward the battery. Rather than to take any part in the assault the glider had been built to support. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Otway stood at the battalion's rendezvous point, sometime before 3 in the morning, every piece of the mechanized, overwhelming version of this attack had failed in a different way. The bombers had missed. The mine-clearing tools were gone. The heavy weapons were gone. The coup de main force meant to blow the inner wire open had not arrived. What remained was roughly 150 men, no mortars, a handful of machine guns, and whatever explosive individual soldiers happened to be carrying on their own bodies, standing in front of an obstacle system that had, by every account, come through the night almost entirely intact. Part 3 Otway decided to attack anyway, and this decision is the hinge the whole story turns on, because it meant committing a force roughly a fifth the size of the one the plan had called for, against a position that had just demonstrated in the previous 4 hours that it could absorb heavy bombers and shrug off a direct assault by fully equipped gliders without losing a single defensive layer. What made the decision survivable was the one part of the plan that had actually worked exactly as intended, the narrow, scuff-marked path through the minefield and the hand-cut gap in the outer wire, sitting there ready and undetected exactly where the advance party had left it hours earlier. Otway split his remaining men into 4 assault groups of roughly a dozen each, 1 for every casemate, under Major Alan Perry, with individual groups led by Lieutenant Alan Jefferson, Lieutenant Mike Dowling, Company Sergeant Major Barney Ross, and Sergeant Harold Long. He sent them forward along the paths the advance party had marked, moving through a minefield that had claimed no one crossing it in secrecy hours before, now carrying a fighting force toward the inner wire in the dark. They very nearly made it without being detected at all. It was only as the assault groups were closing on the inner concertina belt that a German machine gun position outside the perimeter opened fire, apparently alerted less by any organized detection of the assault than by the general chaos of scattered paratroopers and crashed gliders that had been drifting through the area for the better part of the night. Within moments, the alarm had spread through the garrison, flares going up to light the battlefield, 6 machine guns outside the perimeter, and 4 more inside opening fire on men who were now committed in the open, crossing the last stretch of ground between the minefield and the casemates themselves. What followed was close, brutal, and expensive. Without the Bangalore torpedoes the plan had counted on to blow the inner wire in bulk, the assault groups had to force their way through whatever gaps could be found or made by hand under fire, and push into the position itself using grenades and improvised explosive charges known as gammon bombs, satchels of plastic explosive that could be thrown or pressed directly against a target to silence the casemates one at a time. Close to half the men who went into that assault were killed or wounded before the last gun fell silent, a casualty rate that reflects exactly how costly it was to finish by hand and at close range the demolition job the bombers and the gliders had been sent in to do and had failed to complete. When the surviving paratroopers finally broke into the casemates, they found the guns inside to be older, smaller pieces than the 150mm weapons intelligence had warned them to expect, a detail that in no way diminished what it had taken to reach them. Part 4, what makes Merville the case it is, rather than simply another costly night assault among many on this stretch of coast, is what the shape of the failure and success actually proves when you set the two halves of that same night side by side. The heavy, mechanized, unmistakable version of the plan. The version Doctrine on both sides would have recognized as the correct and expected way to reduce a position this strong failed completely, and in 3 separate ways, within the space of a few hours. Bombers that missed, a coup de main force that scattered before it landed, heavy equipment that never reached the men who needed it. Every one of those failures should, by the logic that had governed this position since it was built, have left the garrison with more warning and more time, not less, because a battalion arriving without its heavy weapons and without air support behind it should have been an even less serious threat than the one the defenses had been designed to stop. Instead, the single element of the plan that worked exactly as intended, the quiet, low technology, almost primitive work of a dozen men crawling on their hands and knees, marking a minefield with the heels of their boots, turned out to be the one piece the entire outcome actually depended on, because it left behind no evidence a defender walking that ground in the dark had any reason to notice. The bombing raid, missing as badly as it did, is itself a kind of control case for how seriously the Germans had reason to trust their concrete and their obstacle belts that night. It had happened before. It had failed to do serious damage before, and there was no reason on this occasion to expect anything different, right up until men were already inside the wire. The garrison at Merville was not confused in the way defenders elsewhere on the invasion coast that night were confused, uncertain whether an attack was coming at all. They knew, from the bombers overhead and the wreckage of gliders and scattered parachutes across the surrounding countryside, that something significant was happening around them. What they could not have anticipated was that the version of the attack actually capable of reaching their wire would be the smallest, least equipped, most degraded fragment of the plan, moving through a path that had been cut and marked by hand, rather than by any of the tools their doctrine assumed a serious assault would need. The honesty this story owes the men who fought it, though, sits in what happened over the following day, because taking the battery on the night of the 6th did not mean holding it. With barely more than 100 men left standing after the assault, many of them wounded, and no reinforcement or resupply reaching them in the confusion of the wider battle around them, the survivors of the 9th Battalion could not garrison a position built to hold 130 defenders behind 2 belts of wire and a minefield. German forces, including the battery's original commander, an officer named Raimund Steiner, reoccupied the position the following day, and it took a further attack, this time by men of No. 3 Commando, arriving on the 7th of June to clear it a second time. This is the same pattern this channel has traced in other battles, where a single moment of stealth or surprise cracked an obstacle that raw manpower alone had failed to move. Crossing itself can be won by a method the defender never saw coming, but holding the ground afterward still obeys the older arithmetic of numbers, supply, and reinforcement that no amount of cleverness in the opening minutes can permanently suspend. Part 5. What Merville actually demonstrates, set against other battles this channel has covered, is a variation on the same underlying mechanism it keeps returning to, but with its logic turned inside out. In those other cases, an obstacle fell because the attacker deliberately removed the loud, visible preparation a defender was trained to expect and count on. At Merville, that preparation was never removed on purpose. It was planned in full, attempted in full, and it failed on its own independently, in 3 different ways within the same few hours, leaving behind, by accident rather than design, exactly the same condition those other battles achieved deliberately: an obstacle facing